Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Well, my darlings, I have a 2-part standalone from Bear for this week and next. We have more Lacey coming up after that. We got to find out. We got to save Adele and Wolf Earl, don't we? And after that, we have a 5-parter in the Urban Fae. So this should take us all the way through summer. It's so exciting. So now prepare yourself. Go listen to a little Thin Lizzy or Metallica or the Dubliners, for I bring you Whiskey in the Jar by Michael Lockhart. Stand and deliver, Patrick uttered the words he'd heard so often in tales. He was only now learning the highwayman's art, though he'd often practiced in his daydreams and in private moments away from spying eyes. The dour-looking soldier, a sergeant by his insignia, who approached up the pass, looked down his nose in disgust, tinged perhaps with amusement. Best you put away that old pistol and scamper back to your hut, boy. You're liable to be hurt if you persist in pointing weapons at the king's soldiers. I mean it. You best hand over that purse or I'll... You'll what, fool? The tall redcoat stepped forward and slapped the pistol from Padraig's hand. Before the young man could react, he had drawn his own saber and knocked aside that of the would-be robber. Padraig backed off a few paces and then turned to flee, lest he be recognized. That was unlikely. He had taken a great pains to recover his features in a large red bandana and wore a large floppy hat that obscured his hair and eyes. It didn't matter. The soldier was in no mood to go traipsing through the brush after a silly boy playing highwayman. "Hi! Run, you mewling pup!" he called after the reprobate. He paused to examine the decrepit pistol the young one had dropped. It was in fair enough condition, a bit rusted, but it might still work with some cleaning and brushing. He used the clip to hang it on his bandolier and continued his journey in a slightly less dour mood. Padraig had scampered a fair distance from the pass. He had clung to his saber after the tall man struck it. He'd almost lost his grip. The man was strong as a boar and fast as an adder. He'd expected a bullet to the back at the time he'd run. He'd heard that's what the British soldiers did with rebels and outlaws. He'd been neither, and if he'd made his escape, he wouldn't have to be. His decent enough family had sent him to apprentice at the manor of a noble lord, but he'd grown bored, and the tales told among the local folk had him inspired to try his hand at adventuring. He'd clearly failed. What old Fionn had told him was true. He would need to train extensively before he took on any serious targets. Fionn had been in some sort of militia at some time, or so he hinted. He was as close to as an experienced fighter as Padraig knew. He was lost in dismal thoughts of failure, and dare he admit it even to himself? Cowardice? His shame burned hot on his cheeks till the first cold, fat drops of rain struck them and chilled his entire form. He looked up at the lowering dark sky, slate gray and heavy with rain. He then belatedly looked around for shelter. There was nothing appealing. Just brush and a few rocks that wouldn't shelter a starving rabbit. He was too far away from the estate to make it home before he would be drenched and chilled to the bone. Then he recalled the little shanty that had hidden in the next hollow. He imagined it as some romantic nest of robbers, but had steered clear in the end on his way to set his trap at the trail. The place was abandoned and had a spooky look to it, even in daylight. Now it was the only likely place to hold up until the storm passed. As he hurried over the hill, the drops increased in volume, and by the time he made it to the little structure, his outer clothing was wet and steaming. He was sure he would appear as some spectral form to anyone he saw. He smiled at that. My turn to do the frightening. If there had ever been a door, it was gone. There was an overhang of thatch where he paused for a moment, just in case some wild creature had sought shelter here as well. It smelled musty, and there was just a hint of odor. About then, the torrent arrived, and he had to decide. He plunged into the darkened interior. He paused when his shin struck some hard object, possibly a piece of furniture, long abandoned. He crouched and felt around in front of him. It was a stool, so he set it straight and took a seat to await the adjustment of his vision to the near absence of light. A rumble sounded outside, from over the hills where the darkest clouds resided. He hadn't noticed the initial flash of lightning. He'd been occupied with setting up his perch. The next one was closer and lit the interior of the little shack momentarily. Not by much, but he could see where the hearth lay. There may also have been some wooden kindling. A fire would go right well and ease his rattled nerves. He looked towards the door as the next flash of lightning lit the nightscape. Was that a shape? A living thing that cast a shadow? He saw the shade, but not what had cast it. The crack of thunder sounded almost immediately after the flash and set him trembling. Oh my gosh, that's too low. The torrent became a deluge, and the water roared above him. He put all his skills to work to build a fire on the small hearth at the center of the hut. In the flickering light, he saw that there was indeed a woodpile. It was substantial enough to get him through the night, if he was frugal and kept the fire small. All the while, the lightning flashed and the thunder pounded away, vibrating his teeth with its force. He peered through the doorway, and once again there was a shadow, closer now, and more defined by the ripples of blue-white electrical charges. The head was elongated, and the ears rose above it and pointed forward. Somehow, he knew, towards him. It was only a silhouette, no substance to the outline, yet it loomed even closer as the storm reached a crescendo. Then it was at the door, impossibly large, greater even than the wolfhounds his master owned, and that lounged about indoors, fed better than many of the human servants. The thing was blacker than the night, than the utter darkness that reigned in between blinding flashes when the eyes were stunned and vision faded. He slowly, and he hoped silently, hefted his saber, prepared to defend himself from this beast of the tempest. At the next chain of bolts from the heaven, it was gone. Gone from his sight just as the briefly lit countryside beyond the threshold disappeared between each burst. He breathed a sigh of relief and turned back to the wee blaze that spread warmth and a merry light to contrast with the harsh illuminations of nature incarnate. He set down his blade, an old heavy thing, and placed another stick on the fire. Maybe he'd stolen the shadow's lair. Maybe it was just a trick of the light and shadow. Maybe. He yelped as teeth sank into his shoulder. He rolled onto his side and then onto his back and looked up into the twin flames of enormous eyes. They bore into his own and overwhelmed his consciousness, which fled down a long, gloomy corridor to join the night and the crashing and burning air. Patrick awakened to a cool, damp, and dreary morning. His fire had long since burned out, since he had not been awake to feed it. Pain immediately lanced through his shoulder, and the nightmare image of the blazing eyes and the gaping jaws appeared for a flash, just like the lightning, but solely in his mind. He shuddered, bones cracking and scraping one another at the joints, then rose, his entire body feeling racked and feverish. He was incredibly thirsty, and hunger gnawed at his belly. He searched the hovel and found nothing to eat or drink. Plenty of water had fallen during the previous evening, so he was at least able to slack his thirst. He would truly have preferred a good ale or beer, but he had to take what he could get. He felt confused, and his head seemed to contain more sawdust than usual. He finally reasoned out that if he started at once, he might be able to get home by late afternoon. If he'd been missing, and likely he had been, he'd have to figure out an excuse. At the moment, he had no idea what to say when confronted with his absence. He wasn't a particularly efficient servant, and had failed to learn his duties, or any significant refinements that a young man would need in order to move among the upper classes. He might be sacked and set on the road. If so, he would either have to hone his own survival skills and fighting skills, or find a robber band to join and learn from those experienced with nefarious behavior. He took a last look around the shanty and noticed a bundle of rags in one corner. He hadn't moved them during his initial inspection, but now that he thought about it, they might conceal an object of value, should such a place ever have contained one. He poked at the bundle with a stick of the most undisturbed wood pile. There was a small, hard object underneath the soft, tattered cloth. He set aside the stick and went to work with his hands. Wild thoughts of hidden treasure raced around the inside of his skull, over the sand that still seemed to fill his head. It was a simple jar. It was sealed and stamped with some sort of animal head, an elongated snout with ears that pointed forward. Odd, he thought briefly, like something I dreamt. He broke the seal, and the scent of a rare perfume arose from the container. Ursk! He chanced to taste. Oh, it was sublime. Before he knew what he was doing, he had drained the little vessel. Well, now, that's certainly satisfied, almost as well as a large breakfast would have, and certainly took care of my thirst. He snorted as he stuffed the jar into his side bag. It was past time to go, and he set out for the manor, long, skinny legs applied at a pace that would eat up the miles. The stiffness in his joints soon faded, and the pain in his shoulder subsided much sooner than he would have expected. He soon found himself loping along comfortably at what any soldier would recognize as a dog trot. He breathed deeply of the damp air and took in the odors of the freshly washed landscape. He heard the birds sing and knew that it would not rain again immediately. The air did not hold such promise. The steward was definitely unpleased when the bedraggled Padraig strolled into the estate by the back gate. The imperious Fleming was fastidious to an almost insane degree, and expected the rest of the staff to maintain the same standard. He was also determined to rid his lordship's staff of the shiftless young man who would rather daydream than perform the tasks necessary and indeed vital to the effectual operation of the estate. Fleming was not a tall man, yet he managed to look down his nose at Padraig. Well, young McIntyre, I see that you've traipsed through a bog and a forest of nettles during your unapproved absence. It will go hard upon you this time. Get yourself cleaned up and pack your things. You may meet me back here at the gate in half an hour. Do be prompt. I have other duties and wish to waste no more time on you. You have proven yourself to be unteachable. Padraig grinned down at the man and moved up close so that he could look down his own nose in turn. As you like. I've had my fill of you and your henpecking, constantly on about things that the noble lord doesn't even notice, much less appreciate. All your talk about duty and attention to detail for their own sake. He snapped his fingers under the shorter man's nose. That's what I give for your details. I'll be back down all right as soon as I like. I'll take a meal in the kitchens before I deign to meet with such as you. Best you have cook prepare me some meat before I set out on my travels." He paused, breathing heavily, almost panting. "Ensure that the meat is fresh and not overcooked." Fleming was nonplussed. In the past, the young man had been indolent and careless in his duties, but he had always groveled when confronted with consequences. Fleming had intended to sack him and let him come back and abase himself in a few days. Then he'd give him a last chance. However, the boy had now been insolent, even a little threatening. Fleming would not stand for the assault on his dignity. He made a decision. "You shall leave now. You can stand outside the gate until I have your personal items placed in a bindle and delivered to you. You need never darken the threshold of this estate." That was as far as he got. Padraig stepped forward, which forced the smaller man to give ground. A low rumbling issued from the young man's chest and rose until it blew past his lips as a menacing growl. Indeed, the lips had parted and now stretched into a bestial snarl. This was something else new to Fleming's experience. Something in the sound, in the appearance of the features, in the demeanor of the lean fellow with the ridiculous red bandana draped around his neck frightened him. He took another step backwards in an unconscious attempt to create some distance and thus safety. Yet Padraig matched his steps until his back collided with the wall. There would be no further retreat. While Padraig was taller, it wasn't by all that much. Until now, he seemed to tower above the steward in the shadow of the wall. His skinny frame now appeared lean and strong. Fleming felt that in a moment the boy would lunge in and tear out his throat with those teeth of his. They looked larger and gleaming and perhaps a little longer. "I'll have some hot water delivered to your quarters and some meat." Padraig smiled at the officious little man, surrendered completely, and scurried away into the manor to do his bidding. Perhaps he should bully the man into letting him stay. Yet he wanted nothing more than to return to the wild, to the bracken in the hills. He would, however, demand a stipend to go with his last week's wages. He decided that it was his due and he would no longer take less than he was owed. He stalked into the servants' quarters and into the little cell he shared with another servant, Billy. Billy was not his friend. The young man had borrowed money from him more than once, and despite all promises had failed to return it. He was not a large young man, but bigger and thicker through the body than Padraig, so he had intimidated his now confident roommate for some time. Billy laid curled on his bed, faced the wall. He looked over his shoulder when Padraig entered the little space. "Best look out, Paddy. The old steward has it in for you. Not that I care. I can finally have the room to myself." As punctuation, he expelled some gas in Padraig's general direction. The lean young man wrinkled his nose at the stench and rumbled in his newly found deep and menacing voice. "I've told you, my name is either Padraig or McIntyre. I don't like being called Patty." Billy snorted, rolled over, and sat up. "Yeah, and who cares what you like?" He peered up at his erstwhile roommate and fellow footman. "Why don't you—" His words froze, struck in his throat by the vice-like grip that had seized his windpipe. He gagged and tried to cough, to breathe. He soon found himself on his feet, and then on his toes. Padraig's visage assumed the snarl once again. "You'll do as I say, and you'll pay back all that you owe me. You'll pay double to compensate me for your intended thievery." His eyes blazed and bore into those of the round-shouldered Billy. He maintained his grip until Billy's face darkened and his body started to go limp. Then contemptuously tossed him backwards onto his bunk. Billy coughed and gasped and wheezed for several moments. He was loud, but Patrick heard the faint, polite scratch at the door and the low, sweet voice that accompanied it. Molly, he realized. He had embarked on his adventures, at least in part, to impress the young maid. He opened the door and she entered the chamber, head down over a steaming bowl of water, a towel slung neatly across one arm. Patrick stepped back to make room for her in the confined space. She set the large bowl on the tiny table and placed the towel between the edge of the bowl and the wall. She glanced up at Patrick, then took a second, longer look, as her mouth formed a little moo of surprise. She, unlike Patrick, was a diligent servant and quickly recovered her composure. "Fleming says to bring you this." Her eyes wandered briefly to Billy's hacking and tear-stained face, then back up to Patrick's eyes. "Is there anything else you might need?" she asked out of habit, rather than with any intention to do more than she had been assigned. Patrick grinned at her, a toothier grin than he had possessed the last time he'd done so. "Thank you, sweet Molly. That'll be all, for now. Perhaps before I take my leave, we might have some words." Molly stared up at him. She was fond enough of the young rake. He was handsome enough and had a sense of humor, but she'd matured past the point that such men gave her any pleasure. She preferred the steady types, like the constable who managed the master's horseflesh. I don't think that would be possible, Patrick. I'm spoken for, and I don't know what you could say that, well, you know you've lost your prospects." She trailed off weakly. Something in his demeanor had created a fearsome response in her. The chamber felt suddenly far too small, and he far too large for her comfort, perhaps even her safety. She backed from the room and fled down the corridor. Patrick simply smiled in her wake. He watched the enticing curves of her backside as she stumbled hurriedly back towards the kitchens, almost running from him. He turned back to Billy, who had finally managed to sit up on the edge of his bunk once more. "I'll give you 1 week. When you get your next wages, you will turn over the entire sum to me, along with the rest of what you now owe." Billy looked up in fear. "I won't have enough with just me wages." Before he could blink, Patrick's face loomed up close to his and issued a growl. "Borrow it." He stood and turned towards the basin of water. "Best you clear out now. I'll see you in a week." Billy did as he was bid. He paused only to pick up a fresh pair of trousers. The ones he currently wore were full. Patrick, his belly and purse more filled than they had been since he first arrived at the manor after he was sent from his home, he now loped energetically up into the wild hills above the rich valley. He felt no pangs at departing. He was determined to embark on a new career. He discovered the confidence to once more try his hand at being a highwayman. He set out at the mile-eating pace for a certain path, along which a tall, dour sergeant might make his way back to his regiment. He wore a grin that his erstwhile companions would not quite recognize. It was in a mouth with a wider gape, and the teeth were whiter and sharper than they had been. The face was shaggy and unkempt, like a man who hadn't shaved for a month. Yet he had done so only 2 days past, and hadn't truly needed it. His beard had hardly present before today. He didn't care. He felt that it added to the menace he would need to project. He found his old hiding place behind a large old tree. It had apparently enjoyed the storms. The leaves were brighter and looked full. Patrick took a good whiff of the air and traversed the area in an ever-widening circle. There was no trace of the soldier or any other traveler since the storm. No track and no scent. He didn't quite understand why he thought he would be able to detect such a thing, yet it felt natural. His instincts had been correct. The soldier had taken a leave to visit the city. The next afternoon, under a light gray sky, he stalked up the trail, expression less dour. Behind him trailed 4 poor wretches whom he had clearly recruited, and they were in turn followed by 2 uniformed soldiers. Patrick still had his old rusty saber, and he'd picked up an axe from the yard of the estate as a parting gift from his former master. He quietly stepped out onto the trail, the sergeant looking up startled. Here you again. You are looking rough, boy. Where's your mask?" Patrick smiled his new and improved toothy grin, which pulled back his now slightly pointed ears. "Stand and deliver," he growled in a now menacing tone. "Ha!" the sergeant barked, as rapidly as he had last time, drew his own blade. He was far slower than Patrick in this instance. He stood astounded as he watched his sword, and the hand that gripped it fly off to his right. There was a bright fountain of scarlet from his wrist. He held it up before his eyes in astonishment. He did not have long to be stunned. Patrick stepped up and seized the damaged limb. He raised it to his lips and took a long pull from the steaming claret stream. The dour sergeant fainted dead away, as much from mental shock as physical. The 4 recruits stared for a moment, the sight before them unclear. They saw a flash of blades and watched the sergeant kneel before a man with a wild look and blood-covered face, before he slumped to the ground with an air of permanency. Each was just as happy to pause for a moment from the dreadful pace that the tall man had set as they climbed into the hills. The 2 soldiers who had lagged behind looked up annoyed that their charges had stopped. Then they spied their fearsome leader stretched upon the ground. Before they could react, a figure leapt down the trail and leapt upon them. A brass-clad fist struck Tom in the jaw, and he was soon stretched out on the ground in imitation of his sergeant. Georgie wasn't far behind him. The pommel had blown out his lights. The recruits turned in a gaggle, astonishment in their hearts and clear upon their faces. Patrick turned towards them. "Do you have something for me? No doubt you each took the king's shilling, willingly or not. I'll have those from you, but nothing else. Then you are free to go, unless you'd rather rove the hills with me for a while." The 4 men looked at one another and back at Patrick. None of them had any prospects prior to being pressed into service. The truly destitute rarely did. 3 of them handed a coin each to the eldest and largest of their number. "Seamus," the man said simply, as though it was an introduction and explanation of his life, as he dug out his own coin and held the money to Padraig. "Padraig," the hirsute, whipcord robber replied in kind. He squatted over the 2 soldiers and rifled through their pouches and belongings. He presently stood and offered the muskets and shooting gear to Seamus and the second stoutest man. Since the men had not fled, he assumed that they accepted his offer. He now had a band of doughty men to ply the roads and trails. They left the soldiers completely stripped, but Padraig flinched his now clean pistol from the sergeant's bandolier, then hefted the man's body over his shoulder and loped off towards the next ridge. The 4 men followed. Seamus picked up Padraig's old saber from where he'd discarded it, in favor of the sergeant's newer, better-made weapon. The 4 men struggled to catch up to their new leader. Even though he carried a heavy load, he knew his destination, and they did not. About the time they lost his trail and stopped and stared around hopelessly at the trackless wild, he appeared once more, now free of his burden. He gave them a grin in the lowering early evening light. "Come on, my friends. Those men had a little food in their knapsacks and coins in their purse. I'll keep the 4 shillings from the king. You may divide the rest between you. It is considerably more I have a little shanty in the brush beyond that rock pile." He pointed to the barely visible roof, and the men headed that way without any argument. Padraig decided that so far he liked his new companions. He didn't care for the mindless chatter that too many people made. Until now, he had been unable to stop it. Now, however, he felt he could rip out the throats of all the chatterboxes in the world. The men took up residence in the shack and moved about the detritus on the floor and set a proper fire. None of them explored the rags in the corner. Padraig stepped inside for a moment, but he soon felt claustrophobic and stalked back outside. He sniffed around and circled the area to ensure that there was no more unexpected dangers. He saw and smelled no other canines or lupins. There was no sign of the large black beast that had attacked him. He now suspected that it had all been a nasty dream, and he'd simply awakened with a sore neck. He wondered more at the effects of the elixir in the wee jar. He stopped in a little hollow and dined on the dour sergeant, who tasted so much sweeter than his features had once promised. Like pork, Padre realized, as he munched flesh and gnawed bones. After he was sated, he resumed his patrol. He soon discovered an old still out behind the shanty. Nearby that, he literally sniffed out a cache of poutine. The little jars sat in a row within a solid crate that rested inside a nice, dry opening in the rocks, almost like a little shrine. Padraig grinned again and took out one of the containers. It felt full. He'd stripped off the stopper and took a whiff, then quickly downed the substance. He felt immediately fortified. He worked his way back to the little hut and lay up close by so that he could hear the men and their conversation. He soon found out that Seamus's companions were called Sean, Eamon, and Henry. They'd all been laborers, and work had recently been scarce. Seamus and Henry had relatively steady employment, but Sean and Eamon had been unable to find work many days and times, had been kind of lean of late. They had greedily taken up the king's coin, with hopes towards more full bellies, or at least less empty than most days for them. Seamus and Henry had been convinced more by a chance to do something longer term, perhaps occasionally dangerous, but mostly steady and with a chance for travel. Appealing enough for young men, but this latest opportunity might be even better. The work would be even less steady, but there might be more treasure to be had than a chance to travel, but in style. The more the young men spoke, the more appealing the life of a rover appealed as each built up the idea. Padraig decided he would let them live, for the time being. Over the next few days, the pack of men made themselves a menace to travelers who took the small track over the hills. They didn't find tremendous treasures, but they found food and sundries to make their lives comfortable as their first week came together to a close. Padraig, who was happiest roaming the countryside at night, gathered them around the hearth. "I must travel tonight. I should be back by morning. But if not, what I need to do won't take much longer." With that, he swiftly turned and disappeared from the lodging that was in need of expansion. John looked at his companions after the leader had melted into the encroaching darkness. "That one is strange. Definitely a dangerous type. I've never before seen his like." "Nor any of us," Henry added. "Has his hair grown during the past week?" Eamon stared into the fire. "He's taller, and his face looks stretched. His teeth are longer." Seamus remained quiet for a moment and assisted Eamon in his search of wisdom in the flames. We all know the stories of what lurks in these hills. Nobody stays here after dark. They hurry through quickly to get to the other side of the pass. This place is eerie, no doubt, and not just because our friend who roams the dark. The other night, I was sure I heard strange calls, maybe howls off in the distance. Not far enough. He shivered. Still, we've done well enough. We'll have to move soon. Folk will stop traveling the trail altogether when they realize that the shortcut will lead to disaster. It's a shorter route, but the main road is safer. The men spoke long into the evening. They were young and accustomed to hard work. The recent days of leisure and taut bellies had led to some restlessness. Their conclusions were that the outlaw leader was very dangerous, and they wished to remain in his good graces, even if the adventure had already grown stale. Mostly they spoke of the helplessness they'd learned from those above their station. They understood that their position was precarious, but had no idea how to challenge Padraig or even ask to be released back to their own devices. They were sure that they could not return to their hometown. Too many fine citizens had seen them march off with the redcoats. It would take many more conversations for them to resolve to act, and many more before they decided to put their plans in motion. "Billy!" Padraig barked into the ear of his former cellmate in the manor. It was loud to his target, but with the door closed, no one else would have heard. Billy heard and stirred accordingly. His eyes rolled and stared in the gloom that they could not penetrate. Padraig could see just fine. His eyesight had improved dramatically with every draught of the elixir he'd discovered. One draught every other day or so seemed enough to keep improving himself. As for Billy, he'd convinced himself during the week that he'd only imagined Padraig had become dangerous. He didn't have the entire sum that the former scrawny fellow had demanded, but he had a truncheon he'd scrounged from the wood bin, clutched in his hand just in case the fool showed. He felt the heat from the bulk that rested near the head of his cot. He couldn't see much, but there was a deeper shadow in the general outline of a hirsute man lurking too close for comfort. A stout hand gripped his shoulder and shook him once. He didn't need or want further encouragement. I have your money, mostly. I couldn't get anyone to lend me more." He stopped when a deep, rumbling growl emerged from the obscure, hulking figure that exuded even more menace than it had only a few days past. He forgot his truncheon. Something told him that it would be fruitless and possibly fatal gesture to strike the beastly man who now crouched in his chamber. He felt himself lifted by the grip on his shoulder, and another iron grip closed on his other shoulder. As he was lifted bodily from the bed, he kept rising for a moment, then felt himself plunged until his supine body struck the floor. His head cracked against the floor, but the primary impact had been across his shoulders. He lay stunned, unable to move his arms and to do no more than twitch his legs. Padraig's voice rasped deeply. "What did you think you were going to do with your little stick? Did you have some idea of failing to pay the debt you owe?" He didn't wait for an answer. He knew that Billy still lacked the oxygen to do more than cough and wheeze in an attempt to refill his lungs. "Now, unless you have something else of value, I'll have to take it out in flesh or blood." His hands searched the body of the stunned man on the floor. He found the wee bag that Billy kept strung around his neck. He'd already filched his belt pouch that held all his coins. He noted the little bag during their time living in the same space. He had been too intimidated to ask about it, and Billy appeared to want to keep it hidden, so he'd left it alone. Now he snatched it and broke the leather thong, careless of the pain and burn that must have caused to Billy's already abused neck. He could see the expression on Billy's face grown alarmed. The bag clearly contained something of value that he feared to lose. The round, flushed face worked to Protest, but sufficient air had yet to circulate to allow him to speak above a low whisper. Please, not that. It's all I have of my family. I'll pay you double. Just please let me keep it. Patrick bared his substantial fangs, triple to the original sum, and I'll be back in 10 days. He stuffed the wee bag in his waistcoat pocket. He now had to leave the garment unbuttoned, since his chest and shoulders had expanded. Come through with it, or I'll shove this someplace you don't want it. He barked out a short laugh. Billy could only shake his head, and his eyes filled with tears. The door opened, and Patrick was silhouetted briefly against the light that leaked down the corridor. Billy shuddered at the large, hair-covered beast man that exited the chamber and crept towards the kitchens. Padraig removed a pair of hams from the larder on his way out of the house. He now cared mostly for long pig, but these would likely make his pack happy. He made it back to the shanty before dawn and placed the food beside the hearth. He examined the 4 sleeping men. They were a sorry lot, and he'd have to find some way to improve them if they were to become a terrifying crew of cutthroats who would frighten travelers into quick surrender. He wished to continue to take lives, but the fewer the better. Travelers would tell tales. He wanted them told of how ferocious and his band were, and how much better it was to surrender to their demands and preserve one's life for future travels. He could always find meat wandering the countryside or in the back alleys of town. He left the men before they awakened and found his present. He was soon refreshed, and another empty jar joined the small pile in the brush beside the old, broken cauldron for the long-abandoned still. There was still plenty of fine potion to keep him full and happy for at least another 2 or 3 weeks. He'd never tasted anything quite like the distillation in the wee jars with the wolf or hound head stamps on the stoppers. He smelled the once enticing odor of ham frying. Now he preferred his meat raw and dripping with hot blood. But ham cooking provided a special bouquet to his olfactory senses. He let the others eat, then conferred with them on his plans to shift their operation to the roadway. In the meantime, he decided he wanted to look into Billy's wee bag. So quoth this raven, "Oh, this is such a fun one. I hope you all enjoyed as I did. Have a lovely Thursday, my darlings. Stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.